The year is 2025. The proletariat underclass lives a joyless subterranean existence of endless toil and hopeless austerity. Trapped beneath the surface of an apparently scorched earth, these desperate survivors build the large mechanical armies that fight a forever war. The ongoing battle of the machines necessitating humanity's apparent survival as little more than worker ants in their own vast artificial colonies. Only the war, as ever, is a stage-managed event, a shadow theatre that exists as a pretext for the enslavement of the working class. On the surface, an elite ruling class enjoy the surviving spoils of an Earth still recovering from a man-made catastrophe, the mechanical armies long since repurposed as disposable servants for the idle rich. Through a campaign of deepfake propaganda, including a literal puppet president, who, in the carefully curated guise of a kindly old man, dispenses prompts of homespun platitudes and fatherly advice, the ruling elite satiates the subterranean masses in their own enduring subjugation. As such, they manufacture consent for a life of conceded inequality, where the toil and suffering of the many is used to enrich and enshrine the wealth of a privileged few. To say the Penultimate Truth is one of Philip K. Dick's most prescient works would be an understatement. Here is a story that predicts our current 21st century hellscape of rising inequality, as well as heralding the wide-scale acceptance of things like artificial intelligence, media manipulation, surveillance drones, proxy wars, and environmental collapse. A book that predicts a government that operates as a kind of ministry of disinformation, and the establishment of a post-truth political landscape that empowers a small alliance of the ultra-wealthy in the suppression of the working classes. They're not as widely read as books like The Man in the High Castle from 1962, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep from 1968, or A Scanner Darkly from 1977. The Penultimate Truth strikes me as a work of dystopian fiction, almost equal to that of Aldous Huxley's 1939 novel Brave New World, or George Orwell's 1949 classic, 1984. The book stands on the figurative shoulders of those two literary titans, drawing from the influence of Huxley and Orwell, and bringing to it Dick's characteristic sun-scarred paranoia, a trust-no-one attitude towards government and media, institutions that historically control the narrative through misinformation and manufactured consent. Terrifying in its plausibility, the world of the Penultimate Truth is one in which scores of humanity live underground in so-called ant tanks. The constant buzz of piped-in news reports used to convince these survivors that a devastating nuclear war has left the surface of the Earth uninhabitable. At the centre of the story is Nicholas St. James, the president of one such underground community, who ventures to the surface in search of medical aid. His discovery of a functioning, deceptively normal society above ground exposes the central lie sustaining his people's existence, that penultimate truth itself. The novel's themes are rich in conspiracy and paranoia. The manipulations of government officials, the schemes of corporate leaders, and the struggle of individuals to separate fact from manufactured fiction all encircle the lives of these characters. There's a touch of the Wizard of Oz here, in the disillusioning sense of an all-knowing character turning out to be an invention. The country's president, Talbot Yancey, much like the wonderful wizard himself, becoming a mechanism for systemic deceit. Further parallels could be drawn with M. Night Shyamalan's 2004 film, The Village, in which an isolated community is fed scare stories about folkloric monsters in order to ensnare them, thus preserving the isolationist folly of a delusional billionaire hoping to turn back the clock on American history. For the denizens of the land of Oz and the villagers of the village, the myth of the all-knowing sage or the dangers of the world outside become the tools of oppression. In the Penultimate Truth, it is the war itself that has become a myth sustained for the sake of state control. This cynical or conspiratorial aspect of the story is of course predictive of that countercultural shift that would soon occur in the late 1960s, when the generation, born against the rubble of World War II, now facing down the barrel of a war in Vietnam, would reject the jingoism and misplaced patriotism of their fathers, and instead would look at war and the promotion of war as the ultimate deceit. This is a central theme in much of Dick's work from this period. That clash between the conservative world of the America of his childhood with the growing peace and love sensibilities of certain New Age movements of the 1960s. However, the more obvious thematic consideration of the book is the manipulation of reality. This is a recurring theme for Dick, evident in books like The Simulacra from 1964 and Flow My Tears, the Policeman set from a decade later. It also features in a work like the 1966 short story We Can Remember It For You, Wholesale, which would inspire the similarly prophetic and cynical science fiction cult classic Total Recall from 1990. Throughout his career, Dick would return to this question of how we determine the truth as a quantifiable reality. Rather than explore this concept in metaphysical terms, the objective, at least in terms of the book in question, feels decidedly political. The underground citizens of the ant tanks are effectively the victims of an epistemological trap. Through censorship and the rewriting of history, they lack the means to verify the narrative that dictates their lives. In this respect, the novel anticipates contemporary discussions on misinformation, propaganda, and media manipulation, effectively illustrating how governments lead populations towards policies and politics that are entirely harmful, but are sold to us, the public, as both just and necessary. Another theme in this context is the commodification of truth. The official version of reality here is both false and actively profitable to those who wield it. On the surface, the ruling class exploits the labour of the underground dwellers, siphoning resources under the pretense of wartime necessity, in much the same way that contemporary wars have been used to justify austerity measures and the current cost of living crisis. The book also gestures towards the dehumanising effects of bureaucracy and technology, evergreen themes in works of dystopian fiction. Automated weapons, corporate hierarchies, and political councils dominate the surface world, producing a society where human autonomy is constrained by opaque governing systems. Yet in typical Dick fashion, the machinery of deceit is not without flaws. Individual actions, for instance Nicholas St. James in his attempts to search for help, or the betrayals and double crosses among certain surface elites, the so-called Yantsmen who pick apart their own accepted narratives, finding a bedrock of something altogether more nefarious beneath, create fractures in the facade, suggesting that total control remains, as ever, elusive. Despite such cracks in the dystopian system that enslaves its characters, the world and outlook of the Penultimate Truth is pitiless in its cynicism, and crushing in its view of humanity, as lambs led to their own inevitable slaughter. Of course, there's much more to the book than just politics. Dick is an always inventive storyteller, one who finds an outlet for his cynicism and paranoia through these high-concept meditations. His books often blend science fiction, corporate conspiracy, and detective story, drawing the reader into a web of intrigue, mystery, and suspense, and engaging us through a collision of characters with contrasting ideologies as their parallel storylines entangle or entwine. The tone of the book, and its emphasis on shadowy organisations, uncertain identities, and the blurring of historical fact as fiction, gives it a similar feel to the investigative procedurals of a paranoid conspiracy thriller. Something like the film The Manchurian Candidate from 1962, or The Parallax View from 1974. However, it's the predictive element of the story that most impressed me, as it often does when I'm reading a work by Philip K. Dick. Reading the book for the first time last year, I was stunned by the depth of its commentary and the intelligence of its themes. The book is a definite future shock, albeit one that has caught up with our own precarious present, pitched as it is on the precipice of ever-worsening disasters, the collapse of late-stage capitalism, the climate crisis, and the growing normalisation of far-right authoritarianism. At its ideological core, the book gives further weight to two of the great truisms of Orwell's aforementioned 1984. First, that he who controls the past controls the future. And second, if you want a vision of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever.